Hi, welcome. Enjoy the content, subscribe, and turn on notifications.
Brian Collins always considered himself a lucky man. Married for 20 years to Lauren, father of 3 children who always filled the house with life and noise, owner of a solid website development company, and with a comfortable routine that balanced work and family. He wasn't into big extravagances, but he took pride in everything he had built through hard work. So, when the company offered a full package of medical exams to all employees, he accepted without hesitation, more as a formality than out of any real concern for his health. Until then, he had always considered himself a healthy man. The exam went smoothly without any surprises: blood tests, ultrasound, some physical stress tests. Only one doctor, after reviewing the preliminary results, suggested they perform a more specific test related to fertility. Brian found it strange but agreed, trusting the professional's competence. It wasn't something that occupied his thoughts. After all, he had 3 kids at home and, despite their natural differences, he always believed he was the father of each of them, with everything that entailed. When the report was ready, the doctor called him to talk privately. Brian entered the room, smiling, until he heard words he never imagined hearing. According to the tests, he had a congenital condition that made him sterile from birth. There was no possibility that he could have biologically fathered children. The explanation was technical, full of medical terms, but the essence was clear and definitive. He remained silent, processing every word, staring at the doctor's clipboard as if the answer were hidden there among the papers. When he left the clinic, he walked through the streets like someone wandering aimlessly. He couldn't understand what he had just heard. His head felt heavy, his chest tight, and at the same time, a part of him struggled to believe there had been some mistake. He spent the night awake, trying to find a rational justification. Maybe it was an error in the test, maybe he had a reversible condition. Anything seemed better than accepting that, for all those years, he had lived a lie hidden behind the word family. The next morning, he called another clinic, scheduled new tests, and a week later, he was once again sitting in front of a specialist, this time more anxious than ever. Waiting for the results was suffocating. When the envelope was handed to him, he took a deep breath, opened it with trembling hands, and read, alone, every word that confirmed the previous diagnosis. There was no room for doubt. He was sterile. And always had been. At that moment, memories of each birth flooded his mind. He remembered the day he first held Jason, the tears of emotion, the nervousness of changing the first diapers, the joy of taking the boys to the park, and the tenderness of teaching Olivia how to ride a bike. Each memory, which had once been a symbol of accomplishment and pride, now surfaced as a painful question. How could this have happened? How could he have been deceived for so long without ever suspecting anything? He tried to recall any sign he might have overlooked over the years but found nothing obvious. She had always been a present mother, a wife who participated in decisions, trips, school meetings. Their marriage had its ups and downs, like any other, but until that moment, Brian never imagined being betrayed, much less in such a deep and cruel way. It was then, driven by a need he himself couldn't explain, that he decided to take DNA tests. He didn't mention anything to Lauren or the kids. He wanted absolute certainty before taking any action. He scheduled the tests discreetly, collected samples from the 3 children, and once again plunged into the anguish of waiting. Each day felt endless, every hour dragged on as if time had become an implacable enemy. When the results finally arrived, Brian opened the envelope in his office after locking the door and turning off his phone. His hands were sweating, his heart racing, and for a moment, he considered throwing the envelope in the trash without reading it. But he needed to know. He needed to face the truth, no matter how devastating it was. He read each report, one by one, until there was no room for doubt. None of the 3 children were biologically his. His first reaction was absolute silence. He stood there, motionless, staring at the papers on the desk, as if simple contemplation could change the facts. Then came the anger, a silent fury that made him clench his fists until they hurt. He thought about calling Lauren right then, screaming, demanding explanations. But he restrained himself. He knew a revelation of that magnitude needed to be faced with coldness and strategy, not impulses. He stored the papers away, took a deep breath, and spent the rest of the day locked in his office, staring into space. At home that night, he sat down at the table with his family as usual. Lauren prepared the kids' favorite dinner, and they chatted animatedly about trivial things, school exams, plans for the weekend, a new video game Jason wanted to buy. On the outside, Brian kept a calm appearance, but inside, he felt like a stranger in the middle of a scene that, until recently, represented everything he loved most. And for the first time, he began to wonder who, exactly, this woman was with whom he had shared half of his life. Brian spent days living with that choked truth, suffocating every scream he wanted to let out. His gaze toward Lauren became heavier, every gesture of hers seemed like a cruel reminder of what he had discovered. There were moments when he almost confronted her, especially on nights when she lay beside him, as she always did, and moved closer as if believing they were still a solid and happy couple. But Brian held back. He wanted to understand. He needed to know how much of that life was real and how much had been an act. The decision to confront her didn't come in an impulsive moment but rather as the inevitable result of accumulated anguish. On a quiet afternoon, watching her laugh on the phone with someone, a light laugh as if nothing in the world could affect her, Brian realized it was time. When she hung up, he asked her to talk, without raising his voice, without preparing speeches. He simply looked into her eyes and said what needed to be said, that he knew the truth about the children. Lauren, contrary to what he imagined, didn't panic. Her face remained still, without any sign of surprise or regret. She took a deep breath, crossed her arms, and said, in a direct manner, as if commenting on something mundane, that yes, the children weren't his. She admitted that shortly after they got married, she met a man with whom she had an affair for years. Without hesitation, she gave his name, Mark Whitaker. Brian didn't need to ask who he was. Mark had always been distant enough not to be suspected but close enough to casually appear in some stories Lauren told about work. When Brian stayed silent, waiting for more, she took a deep breath and said that early in their marriage, they took too long to have children. They spent years trying without success, and it began to weigh heavily on her. Lauren confessed that for a long time, she believed the problem was with her. She felt inadequate, incapable of fulfilling what she wanted most, starting a family. But gradually, she began to suspect that perhaps the issue was with Brian, even though he always said everything was fine, that time would solve it. She explained that the pressure of age, the fear of never being able to get pregnant, kept piling up until it became unbearable. And, without thinking too much, she decided to seek another alternative. In her mind, it wasn't betrayal but a desperate attempt to achieve what they both desired, children. Looking directly at Brian, she said she did it for the family. She wanted to see the house full of kids, to live the experience of being a mother, and believed that if he never found out, nothing would change. That's why she got involved with Mark. And when she got pregnant, she was certain she was making the right decision. Every word she spoke sounded like a well-rehearsed justification, almost as if it were the most natural thing in the world. But for Brian, they felt like precise stabs, one after another. It wasn't just about the fact that she had been with another man. It was about doing it coldly, for years, and sustaining the lie as if it were an act of love. He stood there, paralyzed, trying to absorb everything she was saying. The woman he believed he knew so well, with whom he had built a life, now seemed like a complete stranger. And what hurt the most was realizing that, in her eyes, this wasn't betrayal but a sacrifice for the sake of the family. As if, instead of destroying, she believed she had saved something. Brian couldn't say anything. He just kept staring at Lauren, feeling the overwhelming weight of realizing that everything he had lived until then was based on a decision she made alone, hidden, and that she now threw at him as if it were a favor, not a betrayal. Lauren went further, saying that over time, her meetings with Mark became increasingly spaced out until they disappeared altogether, but she never thought about telling the truth. She believed he would never find out, that he would die believing he was the father of the children. And if it had been that way, in her view, nothing would have needed to change. It was at that moment that Brian realized there was nothing left to save in that marriage. He no longer saw Lauren as the mother of his children, as his life partner, but as someone who deliberately deceived him for 20 years. The trust that had sustained their relationship had been completely destroyed. He stood up and left the room, his mind racing. He walked through the house as if searching for air but only found walls that now seemed to close in on him. The place where he once felt safe, where he had created memories with the children, now felt like a carefully constructed stage of betrayal. The next morning, still with a face marked by exhaustion, he called his lawyer. He didn't want revenge but justice. He explained the case, detailed everything he knew, and heard, for the first time, a term he had previously been unaware of: parental fraud. It was a possible path, legally complex, but one that could not only dissolve the marriage but also sever the formal ties between him and the children. The decision was made right then. Brian couldn't live under a lie anymore. He asked the lawyer to start the divorce process, to prepare the documents, to file everything necessary to contest his legal paternity. There was no more room for doubts or hopes. While the lawyer began organizing the paperwork, Brian faced another silent challenge: how to coexist with Lauren and the kids during that period. How to face breakfasts, Sunday lunches, daily conversations, knowing everything he knew and planning to leave that life. Every day was an internal battle, an effort to keep up appearances until the process began and he could finally free himself from that invisible prison. In the following nights, Lauren continued her routine unchanged. She took care of the house, the children, and even made plans for the next vacation, as if the confession she had made carried no weight. Brian observed her silently as resentment and disappointment piled up. There was one detail that gnawed at him more than anything else: the memory of every moment he believed he was a father. The first time he held Jason in his arms, the fear and pride he felt, the sleepless nights with Ethan when he had a fever for the first time, the emotion of seeing Olivia on stage at school, holding a diploma he thought was also part of his own journey. All of it now seemed like a movie with characters playing roles that were never real. But he didn't allow this pain to stop him from doing what needed to be done. He was determined. He would put an end to the charade and rebuild his life, even if it meant giving up everything he thought was true for so long. As the lawyer advanced with the process, Brian knew the next step would be even harder. The courtroom wouldn't just be a place to formalize the separation but the stage where all truths would come to light, where every lie would be exposed, where Lauren wouldn't be able to smile as if she owned a perfect story. And he, for the first time in years, was preparing to own his own truth. Brian moved forward with the process as if walking down a point-of-no-return road, knowing that each step distanced him further from everything he believed was his family. He decided to move out of the house as soon as he handed the papers to the lawyer, taking only the essentials, leaving behind the furniture, photos, and all the objects that, until then, represented his life with Lauren and the kids. The lawyer gathered all the documents, attached the medical reports, the DNA tests, and prepared the petition with rich details. The accusation was clear: parental fraud. He wanted the divorce and, additionally, requested the removal of his name from the children's birth certificates. Lauren, upon receiving the notification, maintained the same cold expression with which she had confessed everything. She didn't beg, didn't ask for forgiveness, nor did she deny any accusations. She simply said he was exaggerating and that, in the end, they had a good life, and the children were happy. Brian was stunned by her ability to reduce everything to a matter of appearances. She seemed more concerned with what the neighbors would think than with the real consequences of what she had done. Weeks passed, and in court, the case took on even heavier tones. The judge, after hearing the lawyer's arguments and analyzing the documents, kept an impassive expression. Lauren, pressured by Brian's defense, was forced to reveal the identity of the biological father, Mark Whitaker. She tried to minimize it, saying it was a past mistake, but her narrative crumbled in the face of the concrete evidence Brian presented. The revelation that Mark was the biological father of the 3 children hit like a bomb, not only among those present at the hearing but also within the small community where they lived. The news spread quickly and soon reached Mark's wife, who until then believed she was married to an honest man, dedicated to home and family commitments. She didn't hesitate. She filed for divorce and kicked Mark out of the house as soon as she learned of the affair. As if that weren't enough, the company where Mark worked also took immediate action. There were clear internal policies regarding ethics and conduct, and he had violated each one of them. He was fired shortly afterward, without the right to contest. His life collapsed all at once, losing his family, career, and social respect. Lauren, for her part, saw her own stability crumble. The scandal made it to the headlines of local newspapers and then to social media, feeding the morbid curiosity of neighbors, co-workers, and acquaintances. She began to be avoided, lost friendships she thought were solid, and shortly after, lost her job, not due to a formal company decision but because the environment had become unsustainable. The judge was categorical in delivering the sentence. He granted Brian's request, ordering the removal of his name from the birth certificates and replacing it with Mark's. Additionally, he imposed a significant fine on Lauren for moral damages and ordered her to pay all legal costs, acknowledging the emotional impact caused by the fraud she had sustained for so long. The punishment wasn't imprisonment, but it was enough to financially compromise her stability and legally mark the severity of her actions. Leaving the courthouse, Brian took a deep breath, as if trying to fill his lungs with fresh air, free from the lie that had suffocated him. But freedom came accompanied by an overwhelming emptiness. He knew no judicial sentence would erase the memories, the shared stories, the birthdays celebrated with so much affection. The pain didn't end there, it simply changed form. In the days that followed, Brian tried to return to a routine, but there was no routine that made sense anymore. The children stayed with Lauren, confused, trying to understand why their father had left home and why, all of a sudden, the visits decreased until they stopped completely. Jason, the oldest, was the first to seek out Brian. He arrived unannounced, knocked on the door, and when Brian opened it, they stared at each other for long seconds without saying anything. Then they went inside, sat facing each other, and Jason asked, his voice trembling, if everything they were saying was true. Brian couldn't lie. He said it was. He told him everything, from the test to the sentence. Jason stayed silent, absorbing the words. He didn't cry, nor did he yell. He simply asked what would happen from then on. Brian said that for him, Jason would always be his son, that the love and affection he felt didn't depend on a genetic test, but that at that moment, he needed distance to recompose himself. Jason stayed quiet for a few minutes and, before leaving, said that regardless of everything, he would continue visiting his father whenever he could. And that's what he did. He spent weekends with Brian, helped with household chores, and little by little, they became more than father and son, 2 wounded men rebuilding themselves from a painful truth. Ethan and Olivia, on the other hand, chose to stay with Lauren. She convinced them that Brian had been cruel, that he had abandoned them out of sheer selfishness, without explaining the real reason. They believed her, or perhaps wanted to believe her, because it was easier than facing the complexity of the story. Brian respected their choice. He didn't force meetings or insist on calls. He understood that everyone would follow their own path and that time, perhaps, would bring answers that, at that moment, no one was capable of offering. But what weighed most on Brian was the realization that, even though he had been deceived, even though his paternity had been torn away by betrayal, the love he felt for those children didn't disappear with a judge's signature or the change of a name on a piece of paper. It was a love he would carry forever, silent, discreet, but unchanging. And with that love and all the scars, he moved forward, facing each day as someone learning to walk again, now with slower, more cautious steps, but also more aware of who he was and what he deserved. Months later, when Brian's routine had already transformed into something quiet and stable, he received an unexpected letter. There was no apparent sender, only his name written by hand, in handwriting he knew all too well. He opened the envelope with the same calm he now applied to almost everything in his life. Inside, a few folded sheets, filled with words that seemed to want to fix what was already far beyond repair. Lauren began the text by saying she had thought a lot before writing, that she knew he might not even want to read it, but she still needed to try. She said she was sorry, that she now understood the extent of the pain she had caused and that, if she could go back in time, she would do everything differently. She affirmed that for years, she believed she was protecting the family, avoiding that he suffer a truth she considered too cruel. Only now, according to her, did she realize it wasn't protection but cowardice. She recounted that, after losing her job, her reputation, and even the respect of her older children, she found herself alone, facing her own choices for the first time, with no escape. She said the pain of public rejection, the accusing looks, the doors that closed, forced her to rethink who she was. And amidst all of that, the only thing she wished for was to at least apologize in person, look him in the eyes, and tell him she deeply regretted it. Brian read every line with a serenity he never imagined he'd have while facing a letter from Lauren. He didn't rush, didn't interrupt the reading, didn't tear the paper impulsively. He simply followed along, word by word, as if listening to the echo of a story that had ended a long time ago. When he finished reading, he sat for a few seconds with the paper in his hands, looking at it as if trying to decipher whether there was any trace of genuine regret or if it was just another attempt to ease her own guilt. Without rushing, he folded the sheets again, placed them back in the envelope, and with a simple gesture, dropped it into the trash can next to the table. It wasn't anger or disdain. Just a calm certainty that he no longer needed it. He had already carried enough. Brian didn't want to respond, didn't want to meet her, didn't want to feed the hope Lauren seemed to place in that letter. What she expected, he couldn't say. Maybe a chance at redemption, maybe a formal forgiveness. But for him, the real lesson had nothing to do with forgiveness. He had learned, in the hardest way possible, that love doesn't survive when propped up by illusions. That the strongest bonds aren't the ones that appear perfect but the ones built on truth, even when that truth is imperfect or painful. He realized that for years, he clung to an idealized image of family, marriage, and fatherhood, without noticing that it was all fragile because it rested on carefully hidden lies. And like any structure built on false foundations, sooner or later, it would collapse. He didn't feel hatred for Lauren, nor did he harbor grudges that weighed more than his own desire to move forward. What remained was a mature understanding that, despite losing everything he believed was true, he gained something many people spend their entire lives searching for and never find: clarity about who he really was and what he deserved. He moved on with his life, not as someone defeated by betrayal but as a man who knew how to look into the abyss and still keep walking. He had learned that starting over is always possible, even when the losses seem too great. And that, more important than trying to rebuild what was destroyed, is having the courage to build something new, even if it starts from nothing. And that's how he chose to continue. Without looking back, without seeking answers that wouldn't change the past, just living, day by day, with the peaceful conscience of someone who did what was right, even when it cost him everything he knew. Suspicious of your wife or daughter-in-law? Don't go through what we saw in the video. Check the link in the comments and get the ebook with valuable tips and investigator-approved sites to clear your doubts. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any updates. See you next time.